Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And it's Donald Trump's first working day as president, and in a flurry of announcements and meetings, he's signalled his priorities. After talking to some of America's top business leaders, he said he wanted to cut corporate taxes, but only for those companies that keep their factories in the country. Those that move their manufacturing abroad would face border taxes when trying to bring goods into the US. Here's our North America editor, John Sopel.
Mark was so nice with the plant. Coming back, I wanted to sit next to him. I must be honest.
Cheery bonhomie from the president as he met business leaders this morning. But don't mistake that for a relaxed demeanour as he starts his first week in the job. He's got pledges to make good on.
A company that wants to fire all of its people in the United States and build some factory someplace else and then thinks that that product is going to just flow across the border into the United States, that's not going to happen. They're going to have a tax to pay, a border tax, a substantial border tax.
He's promising to slash regulations by 75%. The Trump administration was going to be an enabler to business.
When somebody wants to put up a factory, it's going to be expedited. And you have to go through the process, but it's going to be expedited. And we're going to take care of the environment. We're going to take care of safety and all of the other things we have to take care of. But you're going to get such great service. There will be no country that's going to be faster, better, more fair, and at the same time, protecting the people of the country.
And there's an eye-catching promise to cut taxes.
What we're doing is we are going to be cutting taxes massively for both the middle class and for companies, and that's massively. We've been talking about this for a long time. Thank you.
The president's also been busy signing a whole pile of executive orders. One, that the US will have nothing to do with the Pacific trade deal, but also his intention to renegotiate the NAFTA agreement with Mexico and Canada, a much more complex undertaking. But it's these issues that won him the election, and not a bizarre row over how big the crowd was at his inauguration. And one other executive order particularly eye-catching that was signed today is that aid agencies in receipt of US government funds will now no longer be able to offer abortions or advice on abortions in their fieldwork around the world. Now, this has been a political football going back for decades, with Democrats rescinding it, Republicans reimposing it, but it's an important indication of where Donald Trump stands on this issue and what may be the future social policy for America as well. George.
John, thank you very much.
Well, let's go to John Snow now, who's in Washington for the latest on Donald Trump's presidency. John.
Well, Kathy, welcome to a soaking wet Washington, where Donald Trump has been issuing executive orders on his first full day in the White House. Behind me, he has withdrawn America from the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, declared a freeze on hiring any new public officials apart from the soldiers, and is stopping federal money going to any organization that provides abortions to women in the developing world. In his first meeting of the day with the leaders of big business, he repeated his threat to tax companies that move jobs overseas. But of building that wall, which he said he would start on day one, nothing. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris has this.
This is really our first official meeting.
Donald Trump is getting down to business.
Good morning, Mr. President.
On the first working day of his new presidency, he met with the captains of industry in the Roosevelt Room. No cabinet meeting. He doesn't have enough appointees confirmed yet. But Lockheed Martin and Whirlpool were there.
We want to start making our products again. We don't want to bring them in, we want to make them here.
The president felt in his element, shielded from the messier aspects of democracy after a torrid weekend.
We think we can cut regulations by 75%, maybe more.
The good news for corporate America: less tax, less regulation. The bad: manufacture abroad and we'll punish you.
A company that wants to fire all of its people in the United States and build some factory someplace else and then thinks that that product is going to just flow across the border into the United States, that's not going to happen. They're going to have a tax to pay, a border tax, substantial border tax.
But the protectionist-in-chief knows free trade deals will derail his plans. So today, with one of his first executive orders, he banished forever the sweeping Trans-Pacific Partnership.
We've been talking about this for a long time.
A project beloved of Barack Obama that would have covered 40% of the world's economy, undone with a flourish. The elevation of a businessman president, unencumbered by political experience, delights Mr. Trump's supporters. It's one of the reasons they wanted him so desperately in the White House. But it's also put his administration under a cloud. Revenue to his businesses from foreign governments is the focus of the first lawsuit against the president. Prominent ethicists and constitutional lawyers lodged it in Manhattan today, accusing him of violating the Constitution. They also hope their efforts might force the publication of the president's tax returns.
We're going to seek them in discovery. So this is a vehicle, in order to enforce the Constitution, to get those taxes. 75% of Americans, many Trump voters, agree we must have them. It's unprecedented not to. We're going to get them.
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Not if these people have anything to do with it. President Trump's inner circle now sworn into their positions and sworn to further his America First agenda.
We will prove worthy of this moment in history, and I think it may very well be a great moment in history.
It's not a diverse team, but it reflects the demographics of those who voted for him, and he's made clear they are his first priority.
Well, now, in the last half hour, down there in the White House, somewhat grey house tonight, at his first official press briefing, the White House press secretary, Sean Spicer, initially joked about his popularity amongst the media, but was then asked about the promise to start building that wall on day one. And
well, yes, a little bit of obfuscation. I think he's trying to suggest that really this is about symbolic acts by the president at this stage. So it's very important that on the first day in the White House, first working day, he sits down and has breakfast with the heads of big business, because this will be a corporate leadership like America has never seen before. Then we have these executive orders moving against any NGO that promotes or provides abortions abroad. They can't act on Roe versus Wade at the moment. They don't have the numbers in the Supreme Court. But this is about telegraphing an intention to do something. And it really kind of feeds the base and the supporters who want him to act on that. The action on the TPP, you know, moving against multilateral trade, moving towards a footing of bilateral trade agreements, and a freeze on federal hiring, again, kind of shrinking Washington, shrinking big government. But on the question of the wall, he was asked that very thing. He had promised day one, the wall, it's going up. Here's what he said.
When will you start building on the border wall?
I think the president has noted that this was a serious priority of his throughout the campaign. He has already started to work with Congress on the appropriations avenue of that. And so he is doing everything he can to direct agencies and Congress to commence with that work as soon as possible.
What about
anything else significant?
Well, I mean, just as I came on air, he was starting to get into a back and forth about telling the truth, which of course stems from this disastrous weekend of alternative facts and kind of second-guessing who had the biggest crowds at which inauguration. That's been taken very seriously here. He's being asked to account for that. But I think also he's, again, criticised the Democrats. They have very few people ready to go. This cabinet looks thin. I think only 2 or 3 people have been confirmed. So, again, pushing the Democrats to let the cabinet be formed, let these secretaries be appointed so Donald Trump can enact the kind of change he wants to.
For the moment, Kylie, thank you, and she'll be back later in the programme. Well, that White House briefing is still going on behind us. We will bring you more of that, as I say, later in the programme. Now, we're really wondering how Americans who voted for Donald Trump are now reacting to President Trump's first few days in office and the row with the media that Kylie has just mentioned. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, joins us now from Woodbridge, Virginia. Lindsay.
John, as you can see, I'm in a diner. I'm less than an hour's drive from where you are. But whereas in Washington, over the weekend, there was this forensic stuff about how many people were at the inauguration, and President Trump saying it was 1 million, it was 1.5 million, and it being very clear from the pictures that it wasn't, and then sending his press secretary out basically to lie on his behalf. You know, here, I've been talking to Trump supporters. They say it doesn't matter at all. It's a detail. They're not bothered about it. And they say, get used to it. One said, he's not a silver-tongued politician. He's a businessman. Anyway, all politicians lie. So I sat down with a couple of guys who I met here in the diner. They were Trump supporters. And I asked them about facts, about alternative facts. That was the phrase used by one of the president's aides. And about President Trump's first weekend.
I think so far so good. I think there's going to be a lot of herks and jerks. Those things are some of those little bumps that maybe in the future you'll see him pick and choose his battles a little more carefully.
I think it's very simple. I think he came out of an environment where, basically you win in New York real estate through intimidation and force of personality. I think he's still carrying some of that habitual, way of reacting to things over into his new job, but I don't think that will persist.
I think this whole administration feels an obligation to challenge the press when they believe that things are not being reported from a total perspective. And when you get in,
but the pictures showed that the crowd was smaller. It was proven.
So I don't think the average American, let me ask this, cares.
So what? It doesn't bother me. And let me just further observe on that point. This really is not about the numbers at the inauguration. It's about defining a new relationship with the press, which is that the new administration is not going to allow itself to be browbeaten into a corner by a mainstream media, which is very
Which is saying what really happened. I mean, there was no opinion. I mean, this is the point. It wasn't a question of opinion. It was, on this occasion, a question of fact.
This really is not about the numbers at the inauguration. It's about defining a new relationship with the press. It's obsessing. This is typical of the press, to obsess on points of trivia. Here's a great observation that I heard. The Trump supporters take him seriously, but not literally, whereas his critics take him literally, but did not take him seriously. And that's one reason he's not president.
And which way do you take him, literally or seriously?
I take him seriously. Whether he succeeds or fails, we need a completely fresh thinking at the top of our government, and he's going to provide it.
Well, it's raining in Virginia with Lindsay. It's raining here in Washington, where I've been speaking with Donald Trump's first campaign manager, a key individual, Corey Lewandowski. He was absolutely instrumental in shaping candidate Trump's bombastic populist message. He said he's happy letting Trump be Trump, a strategy that many had hoped might be left behind once he reached the White House. So I began by asking Corey Lewandowski if letting Trump be Trump was really the right way to govern as president.
I think it's fair to say Mr. Trump's always going to be Mr. Trump. President Trump is going to be President Trump. But he also understands the gravity of the position he now holds and what that means. And now that his decisions truly not just affect himself and his businesses, which he stepped away from, but they affect the country and the world. And I think what you'll see is this president is a person who's extremely thoughtful, who's going to really weigh on some of those decisions.
Yes, but spending the first hours of the presidency talking about crowd size and talking about yourself, whilst you should be talking about the CIA when you're visiting their headquarters.
John, you know what the tough part is? The bust of Winston Churchill is brought back into the White House for the first time in 8 years. And the bust of Martin Luther King Jr., a civil rights icon, stayed. But that's not what the media reported. You know what the media reported? The bust of Martin Luther King was removed. And that went out to 3,000 media outlets as factually correct.
The only falsehood you can come up with from the press was the absence of the statue of Martin Luther King.
What this administration is going to do, both President Trump and the White House communications team, is they're going to push back on those false narratives, because they have been treated so unfairly by the media that they are going to make sure through Twitter, through social media, through White House press briefings, that the people are going to have the opportunity to hear firsthand from the administration what the facts are.
But the first days were dominated by lies.
Look, you've got a freshly inaugurated president. On the first 8 hours, the press is already out reporting falsehoods about the administration. How does he think he's going to be able to get his agenda accomplished?
The only falsehood you've been able to point to is the Martin Luther King.
That was the first 8 hours.
Statue, but everything everything else was right, and the White House was wrong.
The first 8 hours, the media's already out perpetuating a false narrative. So why don't we give the guy a break? Why don't we give the opportunity for a new administration to come in and talk about what the American people want, which is healthcare reform, which is tax cuts, which is immigration reform. We saw today he's going to meet with Theresa May, right? She's coming in first on Friday. She's going to come in. We're going to talk about a new trade deal. We're going to talk about removing the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's what's going to be talked about today.
He's got his finger on the nuclear button, and if he can't tell the truth on the first day, that's not a happy situation.
Look, Donald Trump was against the war from the beginning, right?
No,
he was against the war.
He is recorded in 2002 as supporting it.
Let's look at what he said, John. Yeah, maybe, okay, I think so. Is that really a strong notion of support?
Well, why is he so reluctant to release his tax returns?
Why would he do it?
Every president in recent memory has issued their tax returns.
What does that matter? Precedent is upside down. Every president in recent memory has done other things that Donald Trump isn't going to do.
And one of his problems is that his advisors have no experience of the White House.
It's the greatest thing. John, this is the greatest thing. You've got the top 5 people.
That means that he's capable of getting things terribly wrong.
Or terribly right, depending on how you look at it.
Well,
you know why? Because that means you want to come to and look at the lens of, here's how Washington's always done it. Okay? Those days are over. We're not going to talk to a foreign leader, even though they're a duly elected foreign leader, because the State Department says that Theresa May has to be the second call on the call list and not the 9th call, or that you can't talk to whatever it is. Those days are over. Whatever the protocols were before, because that was the polite way of doing things, it doesn't work anymore. So I love the fact that he brings people to the White House. Steve Bannon, Kellyanne Conway, Jared Kushner, Reince Priebus, Donald Trump. Not one of those people has 1 second of federal government experience until this week. That's a great thing for the American people, because I think it's very hard to say, if you look back at multiple administrations, Republicans and Democrats alike, they've lied to the American people for 30 years.
What you heard from him in the first few days was walling around with the press when he should have been getting on with the presidency.
And you know what he's going to do today? He's going to meet with world leaders, business leaders, labor leaders, and say, how do we come together, right? When Donald Trump is with a small group, he's so magnanimous and he's so gracious. And you've seen that with Kanye West or Jim Brown or Steve Harvey or any of these individuals he's brought in. What his focus is very simple. He's going to grow jobs in our country.
No misgivings at all about the man you've brought to Washington?
I know him so well. I know him so well. And I am fully confident that when he makes decisions, he's going to do it with the best information possible.
Corey Lewandowski, a confidant of Mr. Trump's, talking to me earlier. Now, that news conference is still going on down there at the White House, and the press secretary has just talked about the Theresa May visit, emphasized it will indeed be on trade, pressed as to whether there will be a news conference starring both of them. He said it's not yet been decided, but everybody here is gagging to see what the chemistry looks like, if there is one. Now, back to you in London. Kathy.
Thanks, John. Well, before that visit, Theresa May has launched the government's new industrial strategy, holding her first cabinet meeting outside Westminster. There are promises of more money for the Northern powerhouse and the science and technology sectors, all part of a long-standing, some might say, existential effort to boost Britain's productivity and competitiveness. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, reports.
It's being hailed as the new blueprint for Britain, a strategy the government claims will grease the wheels of industry and boost the country's competitiveness in a Brexit age. With growth set to slow, Britain certainly needs a plan, but will Theresa May's words add up to meaningful action?
And I think it's absolutely right that we're launching this strategy here in the Northwest.
The Prime Minister held her first cabinet away day in a science and innovation centre near Warrington today, especially chosen to hammer home the message that growth needs to come from outside London for her plan to work.
We need to ensure that our economy is working for everyone. It's working in every part of the country. And this is about saying, how can we create that environment? How can we build on the strengths we already have in different parts of the UK and in different sectors?
Meanwhile, the man who wrote the strategy, the Business Secretary Greg Clark, received a rather exuberant welcome from academics at a high-tech car lab in Warwick. They're developing battery-operated vehicles here, the kind of new industry he wants to foster, and others like it across Britain by investing in skills, infrastructure and regional hubs. In an uncertain post-Brexit world, it's no surprise Theresa May's government, like previous administrations before it, is turning to industry to try and give the British economy a boost. And today's strategy paper is full of the same buzzwords: skills, connectivity, productivity, diversifying the economy outside London, nurturing startups.
It's one thing, though, to have a well-intentioned plan, but another to put the money behind it and make it actually happen.
There was no new investment announced today. Rather, most funds will come from a £4.7 billion research and development pot unveiled in November. More than £500 million has been earmarked for the so-called Northern Powerhouse. And there's £170 million to fund science, technology, engineering and innovation. So what did one former business secretary make of today's announcement?
We have had initiatives like this going back many decades. You know, they come and go. What we really need, though, is continuity. You know, we need to build on and scale up what has already been started, rather than stop, go, start again, clearing the, initiatives away and then sort of reinventing the wheel. That gets us nowhere.
With one part of her industrial strategy underway, Theresa May will now focus on the next biggie, this week's meeting with President Trump and her hope to hammer out the bones of a bilateral trade deal. But it won't be easy.
With all the sort of rhetoric that's surrounding this, and sort of Mrs. May trailing off to Washington to sort of, you know, be stroked by President Trump, I think she's overlooking the mechanics of trade negotiation, which are a lot harder, a lot harsher, take a much longer time if you're going to get something substantial at the end of it than she imagines.
And that's the point. Theresa May knows it's no good fixing your own industrial strategy if the trade deals are all stacked against you.
Well, I'm joined now by Sheila Patel, the Chief Executive of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, who has particular focus on the Asia-Pacific region. Their analysts have said President Trump's trade policies could hit North Asia hardest, though a number of current and former Goldman Sachs bankers are, of course, joining President Trump's administration. Sheila Patel, let's talk about the industrial strategy first. Is there a danger that there's a lot of warm words here, but it'll all be undercut by the realities of Brexit and other challenges like productivity?
Look, I think there's no question that there's a lot of concern that there will be an undercutting of where we've gotten to with the globalization policy of many decades, with the rise of populism and with the rise of potentially damaging trade disagreements. That said, I think you see some constructive statements, both from the U.S. administration and from Theresa May, and there is a hopefulness that they can come to some accord.
Well, I'm just picking up on what you're saying there about constructive statements from the US. There's also contradictory statements, aren't there? Because, I mean, while President Trump says he wants to do a big trade deal with Theresa May, he also says America first. How do you square those two statements?
Well, I think there is some reality to saying for each country as they enter into trade negotiations, some amount of their focus is for their country first, right? That said, I think both of these politicians have an interest in coming to some place of success, just to demonstrate that they are making progress and that they do have trade in mind in a constructive way. You could say that for each country, it's actually very relevant to make sure not only are they having industrial success domestically, but that they are exporting and that they do achieve trade deals that are beneficial to their own countries as well as constructive.
So, do you think, your hunch, I mean, it's early days, do you think that Donald Trump could be good for Britain economically or not?
There's potential he could be good, and I think it's certainly symbolic to see who he's meeting with first and who he's welcoming to the White House. I think also you could see some of the actions he's taken today in terms of stepping back from PP and say there has to be a yin for that yang, right? And if you step away from a deal in Asia, certainly there is an opportunity to try to find a trade partner with whom you do have more accord.
Well, what is the impact on the rest of the world? Because certainly your analysts have been quite wary about the impact of, for example, a China-US trade war.
Well, I think no one wants a trade war, and I do think there is some concern about that. Certainly, I think it was a bit of the world turned on its head when in Davos last week you had Xi Jinping talking in a way that sounded quite capitalist and quite globalist, and you've had quite a bit of noise from other countries that have been the leaders of globalization that are more reticent. So I think there's concern about trade war, but I think hopefully both countries are recognizing that that would be very damaging. I think there's also a lot of concern that China becomes a dominant force in Asia trade, which might not be the best news for the UK or the US.
I mean, overall, you're sounding quite positive about a Trump presidency, and I wonder whether that's because you think he is going to govern very differently from how he campaigned. For example, on the issue of the number of Goldman Sachs executives he's got in his administration. I mean, at least half a dozen senior jobs given to Goldman Sachs, and he talked about draining the swamp. He's not keeping his promise, is he?
Well, it depends on how you define it. Certainly, I would say that, you know, he's pulling people from all walks of life. From a Goldman Sachs perspective, we have over almost 150 years of experience in the financial sector with people being drawn from our organization for many years into public service, and we're proud of that public service.
So you don't think you're the swamp?
Hopefully not. I certainly think that the element that the population that voted for Trump was identifying was the career politician side. And there's a real hope, as you saw in the segment that you just aired, that the business pragmatic side may take effect, starting with Donald Trump himself and his experience in business. At the end of the day, you're dealing with somebody who is actually used to negotiating deals. And maybe that comes out differently in a more business-like, business-experienced way than it does from the political landscape that people are used to and the deals that are usually hashed out in a more quiet way politically. But certainly, I would say it's early days to decide too much about where things are actually headed, and we must take a pragmatic view.
Sheila Patel, thank you very much for joining us.
Welcome back to Washington, where the last few minutes the White House news conference has been going on. Press Secretary Sean Spicer has said he hopes the visit by the Prime Minister will lead to an even closer relationship with the United Kingdom. Kylie Morris joins us again now, 3 days in, about what we all expected.
Well, I think for Donald Trump supporters, it is exactly as they would have hoped, indeed. I mean, we've seen him stage a very kind of dark, dystopian inaugural speech. The inauguration itself has gone smoothly. He's had a rip-roaring argument with the mainstream media, which is also kind of red meat for his base. And he is moving already on key issues, on Obamacare, on trade. He's meeting with big business. So he's signalling all the kinds of messages that they would have hoped in this time. I might just go back to this argument that he's had with the media. Of course, it began with a debate over the numbers who turned up to the inauguration parade, with some outright untruths being spoken at the end of last week, or on Saturday at least, by Sean Spicer. This briefing is still going on, but he was asked again to address the idea of whether or not we can rely on someone like him to tell us the truth.
Is it your intention to always tell the truth from that podium, and will you pledge never to knowingly say something that is not factual?
It is. It's an honor to do this, and yes, I believe that we have to be honest with the American people. I think sometimes we can disagree with the facts. There are certain things that we may not fully understand when we come out, but our intention is never to lie to you, Jonathan. It is a two-way street. There are many mistakes that the media makes all the time. They misreport something, they don't report something, they get a fact wrong. I don't think that's always, to turn around and say, okay, you were intentionally lying.
Well, I suppose remembering that he came from the roots of reality television, this is the Big Brother house, and he's it.
Well, I think what matters is the kind of perceptions of reality and how this story of this White House is going to be told. I think what matters about the question of untruths and whether or not you can rely on the White House is if they're prepared to lie about inauguration numbers, are they then prepared to lie about the number of American soldiers killed in some kind of in a war overseas? So that all matters hugely. But Donald Trump was sent here to be a disruptor. And that's exactly what he's doing. So for the people who voted for him, it has been a perfect first few days, and they'll want to see more of it, and as fast as they can, they can see it.
Very busy.
America is already a rapidly changing place tonight. A massive trade deal with Asian nations went straight into the bin. Business leaders were told in no uncertain terms that if they moved production and jobs overseas, they would be hit with punitive tariffs. And there was more, indeed much more, including a continuing fight with the media. But the real point is that it's now more than clear that this radical populist revolution is likely to reverberate around the world with consequences as yet unknowable. We will try to assess the shape of this new world order tonight and its potential impact. But let's begin with the exciting pace of events here in America.
On his first working day in the Oval Office, and Donald Trump confirmed himself to be America's protectionist-in-chief.
Withdrawal from the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
This executive order terminates a free trade deal with Pacific nations.
Everyone knows what that means, right? We've been talking about this for a long time. Thank you. Okay.
The president is also expected to walk away from the North American trade deal, a move that will end the flow of goods tariff-free between the US, Canada and Mexico.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning.
Earlier today, the president was meeting with some of America's most prominent business leaders, at times extolling his own virtues.
I'm a big person when it comes to the environment. I've received awards on the environment, but
while also warning of the consequences of defying him and moving jobs or factories overseas.
We are going to be imposing a very major border tax on the product when it comes in, which I think is fair, So a company that wants to fire all of its people in the United States and build some factory someplace else and then thinks that that product is going to just flow across the border into the United States, that's not going to happen.
Here we go. At the first press briefing of the Trump presidency, his spokesman continued to express frustration about the reporting on the crowd size at the inauguration, saying it was part of an anti-Trump media agenda.
The default narrative is always negative, and it's demoralizing. There is this constant theme to undercut the enormous support that he has. And I think it's just unbelievably frustrating when you're continually told it's not big enough, it's not good enough, you can't win.
After his statement on Saturday that had included multiple falsehoods, Spicer was asked if he would now always tell the truth, and he suggested the facts themselves could be debated.
I believe that we have to be honest with the American people. I think sometimes we can disagree with the facts.
But he also had a warning for China, saying America would not accept the militarization of disputed islands.
If those islands are in fact in international waters and not part of China proper, then yeah, we're going to make sure that we defend international territories from being taken over by one country.
Please rise.
Meanwhile, the administration is continuing to be buffeted by leaks and rumors. According to reports, the new National Security Advisor, General Mike Flynn, here being sworn in yesterday, is being investigated by counterintelligence agencies over links with Russia.
Thank you very much.
The president is now ushering in an entirely new era, attacking the very foundations of free trade and globalization. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
In the Middle East, the graveyard of many an American president's foreign policy, the Trump presidency is already having an impact even on day one. His support for the Israeli government has emboldened its Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, to announce the building of more homes for Jewish settlers in Palestinian territory, to the fury of Palestinians. And Mr. Trump will anger them even more by planning to move the American embassy from Israel's business capital, Tel Aviv, to Jerusalem, which is, of course, claimed by both Israelis and Palestinians as their capital.
When it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, Jerusalem is the heart of the matter. Both sides claim the holy city as their capital, and respectful of the sensitivities, the rest of the world has studiously steered clear of putting their embassies in Jerusalem. Today there are only consulates here, but that may be about to change. This, the US Embassy in Tel Aviv, could easily take over the huge US consulate site in Jerusalem. So says the man who monitors land use for the Palestinian Authority. He dreads the consequences of relocation.
It means that we have more wars, we have more massacres, we have more blooded in this area. It means that we have a dark future.
It would be a nail in the coffin of a Palestinian state, in your opinion?
Yes.
An embassy move isn't the only building project that has the support of the Trump administration. The new American ambassador to Israel backs the expansion of Jewish settlements in Jerusalem and on the West Bank. Yesterday, the Israeli authorities announced that approval had been given for almost 600 new settler homes. It's obvious that the more this land is colonized by Israel, the less likely it is to become the state of Palestine. For a generation, the prospect of a two-state solution has been like the North Star in the Holy Land. Not always visible and persistently out of reach, but yet reassuringly present. Extinguish that guiding light, and all bets are off here. Chuck Frelich is a former security advisor to the Israeli government. He says abandoning the goal of a two-state solution would be a tragic mistake.
The two-state solution isn't a favor that anyone was ever doing for Israel. It's, I think, the greatest favor that Israel could possibly do for itself. We want to remain both a democratic and Jewish state.
Only the United States has the clout to bring about an enduring peace deal here. But if President Trump keeps his promises to Israel, then America will no longer be a neutral, honest broker. Peace and Palestine may be off the table. John Irvine, News at 10, Jerusalem.
Now, as John was explaining, Mr. Trump has been very vocal in his support for Israel, and it appears this could be at the heart of his foreign policy. But as well as Israel in the Middle East, he also has to deal with the ongoing conflict in Syria and the influence of the self-styled Islamic State, not only there, but in Iraq too. Plus, there is the war in Yemen, which has become a proxy conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then, of course, the question of how to deal with Russia, which has already been flexing its muscles in Syria and the Middle East generally. It is a busy in-tray for any incoming president, not least for one with little experience in foreign affairs. As for that relationship between Russia and the United States, can you remember a Russian foreign minister saying that his president sees eye to eye with the American president on many foreign policy goals? No, us neither, but that was the assessment from Moscow today. The key question then, perhaps, is what does Russia actually want, and how many of its ambitions would Mr. Trump be prepared to tolerate?
In the deep freeze of a Russian January, people here are hoping for an early thaw. Not in the weather, it's too soon for that, but in their relations with America, relations that have been frozen as solid as these ice sculptures since Putin ordered troops into Ukraine. Whether or not the Kremlin helped Donald Trump to power, they are delighted now at the prospect the US may be turning isolationist.
President Putin prefers to deal with a nationalist America than an internationalist America?
Yes. I think that he sees that ideally the United States as a great power, dealing with other great powers as co-equals, would make for a better partner in the world.
And he believes he is co-equal to America?
Co-equal in terms of freedom of action.
In his own backyard?
Yes, I think that this is essentially how he sees Russia.
You can look long and hard for a Kremlin plan in all this, but the truth is there may not be one, beyond causing as much disruption and dissent in Washington as they possibly can. And America divided against itself suits Russia very well. A Europe similarly divided would be an added bonus. In the offices of TV Rain, a rare independent broadcaster now only permitted to operate online, they clearly see Putin's next target.
It's isolationist idea, which are now very popular within Eurosceptics, and Russia supports Eurosceptics, and Russia is trying to organize like an Eurosceptic international.
So is this a victory for the Putin worldview?
It's a victory for Putin ideas.
Trump has already found his way onto the Matryoshka dolls that populate every other market stall here, alongside other Russian heroes from Lenin to Putin. But to a beleaguered opposition here, Trump's election is a disaster. Mikhail Kazyanov was Putin's first prime minister before Russia gave up on liberal democracy. He hates what he's seeing in the West.
We're disappointed about Brexit, for instance. We're just very much concerned about French elections and elections in Germany, because we'd like our partners would stay on their values and principles, as we devoted to those principles too.
So every populist victory in Europe or America damages your cause?
Absolutely, absolutely.
The Russian people, almost alone outside America, are big fans of Donald Trump. Like their government, they think they know what they're getting. But they also know that he's unpredictable. And for the most powerful man on earth, that's not always a good quality.
Well, in a moment, we'll chat live with our Washington correspondent, Robert Moore. But first to our Europe editor, James Mates, who is in Moscow. James, there were these reports earlier of military cooperation between the Russians and the Americans in Syria already, denied by the US.
Yeah, an extraordinary claim tonight. The Russians saying that they had carried out a joint operation with the Americans against so-called Islamic State targets in Syria. Now, if true, this would have been a huge change of American policy because the Russians have mostly just been bombing rebels in support of President Assad. And they've only really coordinated to ensure that their two air forces don't actually bump into one another. Well, the Pentagon very quickly said, no, this is rubbish, it's propaganda. And then the White House spokesman also denied there'd been a joint operation, but said, well, you know, maybe if they want to attack ISIS as well, maybe we will do one in future. Well, you can imagine the confusion that this caused, and that may be precisely what the Russians are trying to achieve, that effectively they're trolling Washington. They're throwing this in there, knowing how much suspicion there is about President Trump and his links to Russia and that of members of his cabinet as well. But I have to say, talking to people here over these last few days, they've been enjoying acting like lords of misrule, effectively trying to mess with American democracy. But the reality is they never thought that Donald Trump would win. They thought what they were doing was destabilizing a future Hillary Clinton. And now they are beginning to ask themselves that unpredictability question and wondering whether perhaps they have created, unleashed forces that one day they may not be able to control.
OK, James, thank you very much indeed. Now, as you may have noticed at the start, we lost Robert from the other side of Washington, so we'll talk to him later. Now, back on the other side of the Atlantic, it isn't just Mr. Trump inspiring a new world order. Politicians in Europe have been pushing for change in upcoming elections and managing pretty well on their own. Thank you very much. In March, the Dutch hold their general election with far-right candidate Geert Wilders on course to win the most seats and perhaps become the next Prime Minister. The French presidential election concludes in May. Marine Le Pen, leader of the Front National, is likely to be in the final runoff. In June, there could be an Italian general election with the new Prime Minister, Paolo Gentiloni, facing a populist challenge. And in September, Germany holds its federal election, and Frauke Petry, the leader of the anti-immigration AfD party, will be hoping to become a major player in the country's Parliament. Now, this weekend, some of Europe's far-right party leaders got together in Germany to celebrate Mr. Trump's success, which they see as a wake-up call for Europe and indeed the world. Julie met Frauke Petry and joins us now from Berlin. Julie, over to you.
Tom, thank you very much. And yes, good evening and welcome to Berlin and the Brandenburg Gate. Just a couple of days ago, just as in cities across Europe and the US, there were some pretty noisy protests against President Trump. And there are very many here at the heart of the EU who are extremely concerned about his attitude towards it and to Germany in particular. He has called Angela Merkel's decision to let the refugees in catastrophic. He's called NATO, as we know, obsolete. And he's also threatened the German car industry with a big increase on its tariffs. But for some, his global stance and his style of politics have become music to their ears, and not least the leader of the Germany party, anti-immigrant party Alternative für Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany, Frauke Petry, whom I spoke to earlier today.
At the party offices in Leipzig, Frauke Petry shows me a collection of defaced campaign posters, a badge of honour for a politician proud to have provoked anger and controversy. She and the fellow populist far-right leaders she joined at the weekend take inspiration from Donald Trump, and she has sent him her congratulations.
People in Germany looked for a platform to live controversy again, and that's what Trump did. He pushed controversy, he pushed provocation so far that it hurt many times.
Part of his campaign was to call for a temporary ban on Muslims coming into the US. Would you agree with him if he carried that out?
We never totally agreed with this ban, but we said that we have to have the right to define the rules of immigration. And what we've seen is illegal immigration into Germany by hundreds of thousands of Muslims who do not accept our rules. And if we ban their immigration into Germany, this is not banning Muslims altogether.
Petri recognises the new relationship between Germany and the US may change, but sees opportunities in it.
Would you rather him have a strong relationship with President Putin than perhaps one with Angela Merkel?
Right now, we don't see any other party, apart from the AfD, who's willing to look at the new European-American balance. What we want is a new balance, a new political balance between America, Germany, Europe and Russia.
Like Trump, her provocative views have caused outrage in a country so sensitive to its history, not least when she said border guards were within legal rights to shoot at illegal immigrants, comments she claims were taken out of context.
Some critics have called you Adolfine, Führerin. What's your response to that?
This is something you don't take easily. We are sort of dehumanized. We have been dehumanized.
But people would say
by main media.
But people would say that you're dehumanising Muslims in Germany.
Well, then I think I have no problem at all to explain our arguments.
If you had a message for Donald Trump as he begins his presidency in this first week, what would it be?
I hope he keeps this. He keeps his unconventional way, and I hope that he will be in good contact, because I think to discuss a new positive way of living together, of having trade partnerships and political partnerships, always requires to talk to each other, and we offer these talks, and I hope we will have them in the near future.
Frauke Petri of the German AfD party talking to Julie there, as you saw. Julie, can you put this into a bit of context for us? How much pressure is her party actually putting on Mrs. Merkel?
Well, they are putting pressure on Mrs. Merkel, but let's be clear, they've got pretty much zero chance of winning power in Germany. They're polling at around 10 to 15% currently, and to get any form of power in that national government, they'd have to go into coalition, and none of the key parties, the main parties here, want to share power with them, so that is a clear obstacle towards them. But it is worth noting that in a similar vein to UKIP, the pressure that they're putting on the main parties is actually getting them to recalibrate their own positions, the party's main positions. And we've seen, particularly with Angela Merkel, she's now said that Germany has done enough for refugees. She also, just before the new year, said that she would now back her own party's call for a partial ban on the wearing of the full face veil for Muslims. So they have that sort of incremental impact in German politics. And it's also worth stressing that they have had an impact in regional politics. They are now represented in 10 of Germany's 16 states and actually beat Angela Merkel's own party in one of those elections most recently.
And we heard Donald Trump obviously criticising Angela Merkel a week or so ago. Talk us through that relationship. I mean, pretty critical for the Germans as much as for us.
Well, they see it absolutely as a cornerstone of their foreign policy, of course, here, and it is going to be fascinating to see how that relationship unfolds, not least, of course, because of the extraordinarily close relationship that Angela Merkel had with President Obama. I mean, he praised her as being his closest international supporter. So how this now unfolds will be fascinating. Worth noting that she didn't actually sit down to watch his inaugural speech on Friday. She was opening a museum in Potsdam, but when she did get to listen to the speech, she said that it made Trump's convictions perfectly clear. But she is a politician who is a pragmatist. She also proceeds with great caution and compromise, and that is the key to her message ahead of any meeting that she finally has with President Trump, that is, she is willing to compromise and she will look at the values that they can share together. Of course, at this stage, we don't know when the two of them will meet yet, but it will be a crucial moment, not just for her, but also a pivotal moment in his early presidency as we try to chart the way his relationship with the European Union and, crucially, Germany progresses.
OK, Julie, thank you very much indeed. Well, while the countries of Europe plot their courses for the future, Britain, as we know, will be going its own way. Prosperity will depend on negotiating new trade deals with, amongst others, Mr. Trump's America. So, as Mrs. May prepares to fly there later this week, there has been plenty of advice on the type of deal she should aim for and how best to negotiate it.
Special relationships which shaped recent history. Reagan and Thatcher, who ushered in the age of private business and free markets. Blair and Bush, who took us into that disastrous war in Iraq. And now, Trump and May. Will their legacy make us cheer or weep? Jonathan Powell, as Chief of Staff to Tony Blair, twice had to matchmake between the then Prime Minister and two successive presidents, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush.
It's the most important relationship that a British Prime Minister has, and it's going to be even more important if we leave the EU, because we're going to only have one alliance, not two.
So what advice would you give to the Prime Minister about how to handle this first meeting?
Well, the most important thing is to go and ask for something. Now, I wouldn't go and ask for a trade agreement, because we can't negotiate trade agreement for years. But I would go and ask about NATO. I would ask the President to commit the United States to safeguarding NATO.
Karen von Hippel worked for the US government under Obama. Does she think Donald Trump will succeed in his apparent desire to be Ronald Reagan to Theresa May's Margaret Thatcher?
I don't expect them to be bosom buddies. I don't think there'll be a lot of chemistry, but I think they'll find common ground in a few issues that matter. Don't forget, I think he gave only one foreign policy speech so far, so it's not entirely clear what he will advocate anyway.
Theresa May will press the case for a free trade deal with the US because America is our largest national market, taking around 12% of our exports, although that is less than a third of what we sell to the European Union. But in 2015, we sold almost £40 billion more goods and services to America than they sold to us. We did better out of the trading relationship than they did.
Given that America has a big deficit on its trade with Britain, why on earth should Donald Trump give us a great new trade deal?
Well, they certainly won't be looking to increase the size of the deficit. I think Trump's made that clear. But look, both the US will be looking to increase their exports and we'll be looking to increase our exports as well. So I think to have a trade deal, and a good one for Britain, done within 2 years, the time we exit the EU, that's going to be close to impossible.
Remember this pair of regular guys, Obama and Cameron, a great double act, frying burgers. But great creators in the red-hot kitchen of foreign affairs? Few would say that. Robert Peston, News at 10.
Now to China, where on the face of it, they should be pretty angry at the stream of insults that have been directed their way by Mr. Trump. Accusations of stealing American jobs and threats of a trade war. Does the rhetoric matter? Well, yes, of course, if you consider the rapidity with which China is rising as a power and the potential flashpoints in the likes of the South China Sea. Today, in public at least, China said it was looking forward to working with the Trump administration. But Mr. Trump's hostility to the Chinese is arguably one of the biggest question marks over the new world order.
Carefully hand-painted and made with an astute attention to detail, these Donald Trump-inspired gifts for the Year of the Rooster depict a man the Chinese are otherwise finding it difficult to decipher. An American president who has repeatedly painted China as the enemy. Today, the Foreign Ministry gave its first reaction to Donald Trump's inauguration speech.
Does President Trump's America First agenda set the stage for a trade war, and is that a possibility you are preparing for?
There will be no winner in a trade war. China and America should work together on economic cooperation and on the basis of respect and equality.
President Trump has accused China of stealing American jobs, flooding the market with cheap goods, and manipulating its currency. Cao De Wang owns the world's biggest windscreen manufacturer and currently employs 3,000 people in the United States, with plans to expand this year.
Trump wants manufacturing brought back to America, and that's what I'm doing. If the American market needs our products and our products need the American market, we have a deal. It's based on mutual benefit.
Last year, Chinese investment in the US hit a record £43 billion, up over 300% on the year before. But the new American president doesn't think dealing with China is quite so clear-cut.
Donald Trump has criticised China for not giving American manufacturers access to the Chinese market while companies like Fuyao are free to set up and operate in the United States. He has declared it's time to negotiate some new trade arrangements between the world's top two economies.
Cooperation is the new watchword at China's Ministry of Commerce, but they are also readying themselves for conflict.
If Mr. Trump wants a trade war, we are not afraid. But without China, the biggest contributor to the world economy, how can he make America great again?
They have never entirely worked in tandem, but for the first time in a long time, an American president appears willing to push China to the limits of diplomacy. Debbie Edwards, News at 10, Fuzhou, southern China.
1 year ago, just before the New Hampshire primary, I asked Donald Trump in person what he would do on his first day in the White House. So many things, he told me, you won't believe it. Well, that day has come. So how did he spend his first weekday in the White House? Just before noon, he signed an executive order formally withdrawing the US from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a global major trade deal. It was a campaign promise, indeed a key tenet of his pledge to deglobalize trade, or in his words, to put America first. Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, has a look at Trump's first day in office and what it tells us for the future of America now.
Back to work on a blowy, rainy morning for the people of this city. For the new president, after a weekend of political bluster, a day to demonstrate that the wind of change supporters had voted for has hit the White House.
The first one is withdrawal from the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Everyone knows what that means, right? We've been talking about this for a long time. Thank you.
Mr. Trump signed 3 executive orders today, stopping a Pacific trade deal, freezing government job recruitment, and halting funding for abortion education overseas. And that follows an earlier order to hobble the Obamacare health program. All these address campaign promises, but hardly yet in a spectacular way.
That's it.
I think it's important to recover from what was a really terrible opening weekend as President of the United States, where Donald Trump was worrying about how the media was reporting the crowd sizes of his inauguration. I think that signing these executive orders is, among other things, to send a signal that, yes, he is going to focus on the priorities that got him elected, and also on some issues that are not about him.
There were dozens of campaign trail promises that were supposed to happen today, from starting construction of that beautiful wall on the Mexican border to the deportation of millions of illegal immigrants and the labeling of China as a currency manipulator. Well, today was the day that all of that got watered down by the reality of Washington, both having to deal with foreign governments and, more importantly, building up a rapport with Republicans on the Hill to actually get some of this stuff enacted.
And on the Hill, as the business of vetting a Trump administration continues slowly but surely, many Republicans are working out which parts of Trump's agenda they can help to vote through and which ones they simply can't support.
So it'll be interesting to see the first time the Republican Congress or parts of the Republican Congress run into conflict with him. And surely there will be those times. I think when you look at a policy that is so stridently anti-free trade, that is something that will bother some Republicans without question. On the issue of infrastructure spending, the notion that we would spend $1 trillion that would be unpaid for, I think will be very difficult for some fiscal conservatives to swallow.
And will, to the best of my ability.
As this work gets underway, though, Team Trump is continuing to fire salvos at the media over the number of people who attended the inauguration.
Good evening.
And an ill-tempered diatribe from the president's press secretary on Saturday.
The thing that I found most disturbing was that he spews a bunch of falsehoods and then he turns to the reporters in the room and he says, this is what you should be reporting and covering. I cannot think of, at least in the time that I've been in Washington, anyone ever standing there and lecturing the press, any government official, and telling them this is what you cover.
At today's first formal White House press conference, he returned to the attack.
Over and over again, there's this constant attempt to undermine his credibility and the movement that he represents. And it's frustrating for not just him, but I think so many of us that are trying to work to get this message out.
The downpours seemed fitting for a day when the president showed he'll have to obey certain laws of politics, and the news media learnt that it'll be shown no quarter. Less a bright new dawn, more welcome to the swamp.
Mark Urban with that report. Well, just before we came on air, I caught up with the Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. You'll remember him as Hillary Clinton's main challenger for the Democratic nomination. He doesn't share much in common with Donald Trump, but they do share a certain view on anti-globalization. So I asked him what he made of the cancellation of such a major trade deal today.
The current trade policies that we have, which include NAFTA and CAFTA and permanent normal trade relations with China, have been a disaster for the American worker because many large corporations have simply shut down here and moved to low-wage countries all over the world. We have lost millions of decent-paying jobs. So I campaigned very strongly against the TPP, and I'm glad that Trump followed through and has gotten us out of the TPP. But if Trump is going to be honest with the American people, what he has also got to do is to withdraw his manufacturing in countries like Mexico and Bangladesh and Turkey and China, where he's paying very low wages. So if he wants to be honest with the American people when he says buy American, hire American, he's got to bring those jobs back to the United States.
For America's allies, that word withdraw is critical because a lot of people are looking at Donald Trump and saying, is he going to pull America away from the rest of the world?
Well, he may want to do that, but that's certainly not my view. I believe we need to maintain and strengthen our contacts with people all over the world. Look, I'd rather have people sitting around the table arguing with each other rather than going to war. Climate change is a planetary crisis in which we've got to work together. The exploitation of children and women is a global crisis. We have got to work together. So I think trying to develop good trade policies for the people of our country and around the world does not mean to me that we should withdraw from the world or not play an active role in the United Nations or other international bodies.
What do you make of the language he used there when he talked about America first, when he talked about America's carnage in that inaugural address?
Obviously, that's the kind of language used by isolationists in this country in the 1920s. It's not language that I am at all sympathetic to. We are living in an increasingly small world. It is important that countries work together in every way possible. So if it's America first, then it's the UK first, then it's China first, then it's Japan first. I think we need international cooperation to make sure that we have a world of peace, a world in which we effectively combat climate change and deal with so many of the other serious problems facing our planet.
Theresa May becomes the first leader to meet Donald Trump. She's hoping for a trade deal with him. How outward-looking do you think Donald Trump will be with other countries?
I can't predict. I honestly can't predict. But the United States is the most powerful nation on earth. We have got to work with countries all over the world to address the very serious crises facing our planet.
Senator Bernie Sanders. Well, joining me now, the Republican strategist Ron Christie and Molly Ball for The Atlantic. Very nice to have you both here. This was a day with such huge expectations, the weight of all that was going to be done. How did it add up, Molly?
Well, several different things happened today. I mean, I think in policy terms, it was significant that President Trump issued some executive orders starting to actually implement some of his policy agenda. And then on the other hand, you had his press secretary, Sean Spicer, do a sort of do-over press conference, seeming to want to atone for the disastrous press conference that he gave on Saturday, where he said a lot of things that were plainly not true and really stuck a thumb in the eye of the American media. Still a very combative and antagonistic press conference, but clearly trying to make amends in a way. And so you have an administration that I think is still finding its footing, that is behind the curve in a lot of ways, that is not enjoying a conventional honeymoon. You have Trump seeming to want to govern very much the way he campaigned.
That is the point, Ron. Where was the honeymoon? I mean, it got off to a really rocky start, not just the press conference, but the CIA discussion at the weekend. Was this a chance to sort of reset all of that opening?
I think so, and I think Molly's exactly right. I mean, you notice that there's already sort of a do-over with some of the statements they've made and some of the comments that they've said for the last couple of days. I think they need to recognize now they're no longer campaigning. The campaign is over. And the most difficult thing that I found walking in 16 years ago on day one of administration is, how do we do this? How do we now translate for what we said to the American people we're going to do?
But you are a Republican. You're supporting the Trump administration now. When he pulls in the anti-abortion legislation, when he pulls out these global trade deals, do you cheer?
I don't cheer. I go by policy, and I go by specifically what the president has said that he would do, how he's actually acted. I think pulling out of TPP was a mistake. I think this is something
the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yes, I think this is something that President Obama negotiated in good faith with several other nations, and I think that it would have helped American business, helped American workers. And he said, no, I'm going to issue an executive order. I'm going to pull out. I don't agree with that, but that was his decision.
But this is something that Trump has been consistent about, both in the campaign and in his inaugural address. It was a very dark and divisive inaugural address, but it was a declaration of war on both parties. And so you have him doing things now that are in line with conventional conservative doctrine.
You say it's a declaration of war, Molly,
but something like trade, that is something that someone like Bernie Sanders is more sympathetic.
Exactly. And instead of seeing it as a declaration of war, maybe you say this is what the American people voted for. You know, he's tried to sidestep Washington. He doesn't care about party politics. He wants to talk to the people that voted him in, and that's what he's done consistently, isn't it?
That is exactly the way he and his team see it. The question is, how big a group is that, and is that going to be effective? I think people voted for Trump because they thought he might be able to, because he is so unconventional, finally get something done in Washington. They see the gridlock in Washington as a bipartisan problem that they'd like him to overcome as a businessman. If he runs up against the reality of governing and can't make those wheels turn here in the Senate where we're standing and on Capitol Hill, I think that is going to make people disappointed in him.
Ron, it's been difficult for him to get the team through. This was a point Sean Spicer made, that people that he thought would be okay, like Mike Pompeo of the CIA, had Democrats sort of stopping that from going through. Do you think we are going to see exactly the same sense of gridlock now?
I do, and in fact, it's typical. I mean, Chuck Schumer, the, of course, now Minority Leader of the United States Senate, wields a lot of power in being able to hold up some of the nominees that President Trump wants to put into office, and it's the usual horse trading. I think this is only a marker, a spot for negotiation for the Democrats and the new administration.
Do the Democrats have an obligation to say, look, we may not like this man, we disagree with a lot of what he's doing, but actually we cannot afford to have a system, an administration that simply doesn't function for another 8 years?
Well, without taking a side on what they ought to do, I think the Democrats haven't really decided what to do as a matter of strategy. So, you know, you're talking about a delay of a few days, but the Democrats do not have the ability, nor do they seem to have the willingness to actually stop any of these cabinet nominees. So far, it looks like they're all going to get through, which would be a remarkable thing for any president. They started out behind. They weren't up to date on a lot of the paperwork when they started, but it actually does look like the entire cabinet will be confirmed. Then it will be on to things like the Supreme Court and trying to find a replacement for Obamacare, and those will also be huge battles for this administration.
Molly Ball, Ron Christie, great to have you here. We're going to hear more about the Supreme Court and indeed about those immigration measures later in the week.